La Chambre procèdera.
The House will now proceed to the taking of the deferred recorded division on the motion at second reading of Bill C-223 under private members' business.
La question est la suivante.
The question is as follows.
By Mr. Green, moved that Bill C-223, an act to develop a national framework for a guaranteed livable basic income, be now read a second time and referred to the Standing Committee on Human Resources, Skills and Social Development and the Status of Persons with Disabilities. The 10-minute period for members voting electronically has started, and the House will now proceed to the vote. We will start with the sponsor of the item.
Ms. Gazan.
Ms. Gazan.
We will now proceed to members participating in person. All those at my left who favor the motion will please rise. Sixth row.
Madam Hughes.
Madam Hughes.
Mr. Cannings.
Mr. Cannings.
Ms. Ashton.
Ms. Ashton.
Cinquième rangée.
Fifth row.
Quatrième.
Fourth row on my left.
Troisième.
Third row on my left.
McGregor.
Mr. McGregor.
Deuxième.
Second row on my left.
Ms. McPherson.
Ms. McPherson.
Ms. Idlout.
Ms. Idlout.
Première rangée.
First row on my left.
Mr. Massey.
Mr. Massey.
Mr. Singh.
Mr. Singh.
Ms. Matheson.
Ms. Matheson.
Que tous ceux à ma droite qui
All those on my right in favor of the motion will please rise. Sixth row.
Mr. Hanley.
Mr. Hanley.
Mr. McDonald Malpeck.
Mr. McDonald Malpeck.
Fifth row on my right who support the motion.
Mr. McDonald Avalon.
Mr. McDonald Avalon.
Mr. Morrissey.
Mr. Morrissey.
Ms. Hefner.
Ms. Hefner.
Mrs. Zaid.
Mrs. Zaid.
Mr. Rogers.
Mr. Rogers.
Fourth row on my right.
Mr. Hardy.
Mr. Hardy.
Mr. Nakfi.
Mr. Nakfi.
Ms. Demoff.
Ms. Demoff.
Mrs. Atwin.
Mrs. Atwin.
Mr. Fisher.
Mr. Fisher.
Mr. Long.
Mr. Long.
Ms. May, Saanich Gulf Islands.
Ms. May, Saanich Gulf Islands.
Mr. Morris.
Mr. Morris.
Troisième rang.
Third row on my right.
Mr. Area.
Ms. DeBrusen.
Ms. DeBrusen.
Ms. Zarevitz.
Ms. Zerowitz.
Mr. Assassi.
Mr. Assassi.
Monsieur El Khoury.
Monsieur El Khoury.
Ms. Kwan.
Ms. Kwan.
Deuxième.
Second row on my right.
Mr. Casey.
Mr. Casey.
Mr. Desjardins.
Mr. Desjardins.
Ms. Zarillo.
Ms. Zarillo.
First row on my right.
Monsieur Bouleris.
Monsieur Boudris.
Mr. Angus.
Mr. Angus.
Mr. Davies.
Mr. Davies.
Que tous ceux
All those on my left who are opposed to the motion will please rise. Sixth row.
Mr. Morrison.
Mr. Morrison.
Mr. Dowdle.
Mr. Dowdle.
Mr. Vierson.
Mr. Vierson.
Mr. Giovanni.
Mr. Giovanni.
Mr. Stewart, Toronto St. Paul's.
Mr. Stewart, Toronto St. Paul's.
Monsieur Blanchette-Jonca.
Monsieur Blanchette-Jonca.
Madame Behubé.
Madame Bérubé.
cinquième rangée.
Fifth row on my left.
Mr. Dreeshen.
Mr. Dreeshen.
Mr. Majumdar.
Mr. Majumdar.
Mr. Tolmy.
Mr. Tolmy.
Mrs. Wagenthal.
Mrs. Wagenthal.
Mr. Albus.
Mr. Albus.
Mr. Bragdon.
Mr. Bragdon.
Mr. Allison.
Mr. Allison.
Mr. Nader.
Mr. Nader.
Mr. McLean.
Mr. McLean.
Mr. Weber.
Mr. Weber.
Mr. McGuire.
Mr. McGuire.
Mr. Reed.
Mr. Reed.
Mr. Shields.
Mr. Shields.
Mr. Falk Provencher.
Mr. Falk Provencher.
Mr. Williamson.
Mr. Williamson.
Mr. Arnold.
Mr. Arnold.
Madame Saint-Clair Desgagnés.
Madame Sinclair Desgagnés.
Madame Desbiens.
Madame Desbiens.
Fourth row on my left.
Mr. Muse.
Mr. Muse.
Mr. Redicott.
Mr. Redicott.
Mr. Van Popta.
Mr. Van Popta.
Mr. Waugh.
Mr. Waugh.
Ms. Rude.
Ms. Rude.
Monsieur Lou.
Monsieur Lou.
Monsieur Généreux.
Monsieur Généreux.
Mr. Genereux.
Mr. Genereux.
Mr. Lobb.
Mr. Lobb.
Mr. Mazer.
Mr. Mazier.
Mr. Davidson.
Mr. Davidson.
Monsieur Gould.
Monsieur Gould.
Mr. Currick.
Mr. Kirk.
Mr. Epp.
Mr. Epp.
Monsieur Plamondon.
Monsieur Plamondon.
Third row on my left.
Mr. Macaulay, Edmonton West.
Mr. Macaulay, Edmonton West.
Mrs. Goodridge.
Mrs. Goodridge.
Mr. Moore.
Mr. Moore.
Monsieur Godin.
Monsieur Godin.
Madame Vien.
Madame Vien.
Mr. Morant.
Mr. Morantz.
Mr. Hoback.
Mr. Hoback.
Mrs. Cramp-Nyman.
Mrs. Cramp-Nyman.
Mrs. Roberts.
Mrs. Roberts.
Mr. Patser.
Mr. Patser.
Mrs. Gallant.
Mrs. Gallant.
Deuxième rangée.
Second row on my left.
Mr. Kelly.
Mr. Baldinelli.
Mr. Baldinelli.
Mr. Cooper.
Mr. Cooper.
Mr. Williams.
Mr. Williams.
Monsieur Berthold.
Monsieur Berthold.
Mr. Workington.
Mr. Workington.
Mr. Aboutaïf.
Mr. Aboutaïf.
Mrs. Kuzi.
Mrs. Kuzi.
Ms. Ferrari.
Ms. Ferrari.
Mrs. Bloch.
Mrs. Bloch.
Madame de Bellefeuille.
Madame de Bellefeuille.
Madame Michaud.
Madame Michaud.
Première rangée.
First row on my left.
Mr. Schmale.
Mr. Bazan.
Mr. Bazan.
Mr. Kimmich.
Mr. Kimmich.
Mr. Perkins.
Mr. Perkins.
Mr. Brock.
Mr. Brock.
Monsieur Deltel.
Monsieur Deltel.
Mrs. Stubbs.
Mrs. Stubbs.
Monsieur Paulus.
Monsieur Paulus.
Ms. Lewis, Haldimand, Norfolk.
Miss Lewis, Haldeman, Norfolk.
Mrs. Gray.
Mrs. Gray.
Mr. Barlow.
Mr. Barlow.
Mr. Ellis.
Mr. Ellis.
Monsieur Saint-Marie.
Monsieur Saint-Marie.
Monsieur Terrien.
Monsieur Terrien.
Que tous ceux
All those on my right opposed to the motion will please rise.
Mr. Baines.
Mr. Bain.
Ms. Bradford.
Miss Bradford.
Mr. Gahir.
Mr. Gahir.
Madame Lapointe.
Madame Lapointe.
Back to Madame Châtel.
Madame Châtel.
Mr. Miao.
Mr. Meow.
Mrs. Thompson.
Miss Thompson.
fifth row on my right.
Mr. McKinnon, Coquitlam, Port Coquitlam.
Mr. McKinnon, Coquitlam, Port Coquitlam.
Madame Shanahan.
Madame Shanahan.
Ms. Cedar Brampton South.
Miss Cedar Brampton South.
Mr. Sorbara.
Mr. Sorbera.
Mr. Chang.
Mr. Chang.
Ms. Yip.
Ms. Yip.
Mr. Lewis, Kitchener-Conestoga.
Mr. Lewis, Kitchener-Conestoga.
Mr. Van Bynen.
Mr. Van Bynen.
Third row on my right.
Monsieur Yakino.
Monsieur Yacono.
Mr. Joe Howry.
Mr. Johari.
Mr. Sidhu, Brampton East.
Mr. Cedar Brampton East.
Mr. Badaway.
Mr. Badaway.
Mr. Sousa.
Mr. Sousa.
Mr. Duguid.
Mr. Duguid.
Mr. Sarai.
Mr. Sarai.
Mr. Kellaway.
Mr. Kellaway.
Ms. Vandenbeld.
Ms. Vandenbelt.
Madame Koutrakis.
Madame Koutrakis.
Madame Brière.
Madame Brière.
Third row on my right.
Ms. Jones.
Ms. Jones.
Ms. O'Connell.
Ms. O'Connell.
Mr. Lamoureux.
Mr. Lamoureux.
Mr. Fragascatos.
Mr. Fagascatos.
Mr. Vancouverden.
Mr. Vancouverden.
Mr. Kuzmarchuk.
Mr. Kuzmarchuk.
Mr. May Cambridge.
Mr. May Cambridge.
Ms. Dillon.
Ms. Dillon.
Mr. Assassi.
Mr. Assassi.
Deuxième rangée à ma droite.
Second row on my right.
Mr. McGinty.
Mr. McGinty.
Mr. Scarpalegia.
Mr. Scarpalegia.
Ms. Cara.
Ms. Cara.
Madame Saint-Onge.
Madame Saint-Onge.
Ms. Sahota.
Ms. Sahota.
Madame Petitpas-Taylor.
Madame Petipat-Taylor.
Ms. Jazek.
Ms. Jazik.
Première rangée à
First row on my right.
Mr. Sajan.
Mr. Sajan.
Ms. Hutchings.
Ms. Hutchings.
Ms. Tassi.
Ms. Tassi.
Mr. Varani.
Mr. Varney.
Ms. Sack.
Ms. Sachs.
Ms. Murray.
Ms. Murray.
la Chambre.
The House will now wait for the electronic voting period to end before resuming its proceedings.
Je désire informer
I wish to inform the House that the electronic voting period has ended.
if members were not able to vote due to technical difficulties, they may now use the raise hand function, and the chair will now recognize them. I see the honourable member from Willowdale has
Thank
rised.
you, Mr. Speaker. Given my exuberance for Bill C-223, I voted twice in error. I would like my vote to reflect yay. I vote in favor. Thank you.
The honourable member from Sherwood Park, Fort Saskatchewan.
Thank you, Chair. I had a problem with the voting app, and I wish to cast a vote as nay.
Dennis, nay contre.
The honourable member from Regina Leuven.
I have a problem with the app as well, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to vote nay.
Mr. Stanley, nay contre.
Le bureau va maintenant compiler les...
The table will now compile the results of the vote.
Yeas pour 54-54, nays contre 273-273.
Je déclare la motion
I declare the motion defeated.